Okay. In addition to more people migrating to cities because of the lack of affordable farmable land, there was also the issue of European wars that were happening overseas. And remember, these are still European colonies, so they're still owned, I guess, by these European countries. And so this caused problems, particularly with import and export, because you may have in one small area, like at a trading post, where you've got, ships being built by one country and stuff being exported by another country. It's like all of these different groups together who are just doing business together in the colonies, and then all of a sudden they get the word, oh, you're not allowed to do trade with the Dutch anymore or the French anymore because we're at war with them. So there goes a big chunk of your business, or maybe your business is shut down entirely. So that had a very negative impact on the colonists' relationships with their European, motherlands, so to speak. What else? Okay, so geography is really important in understanding like the impact that these wars would have, and this is important understanding why the American Revolution sort of began and kicked off and fomented where it did rather than somewhere else. So New England was really the hub for all things sea trade and for shipbuilding. The middle colonies, that's going to be more like Virginia, that kind of thing. That's going to be more farming, kind of plantation based. And then also as they're sort of moving west, there's going to be a lot more subsistence farming happening there too. And in the lower south, so the Carolinas, Georgia, all that, Florida, all those states, those colonies are not states yet, they are growing staple crops and are hugely dependent on slave labor. In fact, it becomes more and more the case that over time the slaves start to vastly outnumber the white population in those areas, and that's going to be an issue later on when different colonies are deciding whether to join up with the revolution or not. So New England, that's kind of what's known as the seat of the American Revolution, and that's largely to do with they were the ones who were most impacted by these European wars and the whole import-export issue. So they got fed up faster than anyone else, and so therefore are largely responsible for the revolution. More to know about settling at the time. So this was a time of continued exploration and settlement, moving further and further west because the East Coast had basically been all settled up. So as future generations are being born or moving in, coming over, there wouldn't necessarily be room for them to make their way, so they're going to push further and further west, outward. So that made travel journals really, really popular because more people are moving around and going to different places and recording what they see and what they do, including Madam Knight and her travel journal. The Native Americans were becoming increasingly dominated by these white frontier settlers, getting pushed further and further to the margins, and that doesn't get any better. And something that became clear very quickly is that the governments, the overseas governments, the European governments that were technically still in control of these colonies, knew very little about them. So it's that kind of frustrating thing that happens when you've got, those in charge and who are making really important decisions don't know. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know anything about, they knew some about these colonies, but remember, the communications they're getting are through letters. It takes a really long time. So it's just what becomes America, these colonies they might as well be on the moon. The distance, it'd be even worse because there's no internet, right? So it might as well be on a different planet. And, communication back and forth was pretty limited, and so the colonists started to get really annoyed with being told what to do by overseas governments who really don't know anything about them or their lives or what they are facing or dealing with. And then increased diversity and economic ability, resources, started to really lead colonists to question the values of the mother country. the question becomes like, well, why are we an English colony if so many of the people who live here are Dutch or Irish or Scotch, whatever? Like, we're not English. Why are we paying taxes to England? And why are we doing that at all? Like, we're actually the ones who are making all this money, and we're the ones who have all this economic power. Really, they're the ones who are dependent on us, not the other way around anymore. Like, we could cut ties at any time and be totally fine. So yeah. So one of the things that I would have y'all do, just again, group activity, is to take some time to look at Mary Rowlandson again, but also how she stacks up against Sarah Kemble Knight in her narrative. So they both wrote narratives, and they're both pretty mobile throughout the course of those narratives. So there are definitely some similarities between the two women, but there are some striking differences as well. And both women are kind of, I guess, pretty good representations of the cultural climates in which they're living. So there are things that, for instance, that Madam Knight can do that Mary would never have been able to dream of doing. She's got freedoms that Mary just doesn't have. So they're both traveling a lot, but for very different reasons, and so that's going to impact their narratives quite a bit. So that's just something I would have had y'all look at. It might come up again later. Might want to talk about it on the discussion board. Who knows? Something to think about. Okay. So the Enlightenment, I don't want to dig too deep into it, and there's a lot to be said about the Enlightenment, so this is just a very, very light brushstroke, but this is so important. It's so important to understand the massive philosophical changes and scientific discoveries that were happening during this time that are going to hugely impact the worldviews of the people living during this time. So again, the Enlightenment was a time of massive scientific discovery. Isaac Newton began his mission to unfold all of nature's laws. Just even the idea that nature has laws and that they can be unfolded by humans is a huge change in worldview than what had come before. Before this time, the idea was, okay, if our holy text, whatever the holy text may be, let's say the Bible, the holy text doesn't give an explanation for it, and your religious leader doesn't know the answer, then that means you're not meant to know. There are just some things that human beings are never meant to understand, even if it's something as simple as, like, why does a spider spin a web? Well, there's nothing about it in the official guide to life that is the Bible, and if there's no answer there, then there is no answer. But the Enlightenment the Enlightenment thinkers said, no, we don't think we know everything. In fact, our philosophy is, I don't know yet. And it's the yet that changes everything. It's admitting that you don't know, but also that little yet on the end suggests that it can be known by human beings. Sir Isaac Newton said, "We build too many walls and not enough bridges," which I think is a pretty enlightened quote. Some of his more important discoveries for the time: gravity. Obviously, gravity existed before Sir Isaac Newton. People knew that if you let go of something, it would fall to the ground, but he was the first one to sort of codify the laws of gravity and come up with rational explanations for how gravity worked, which was pretty major. He also came up with the law of inertia, this idea that, basically, simplify it, sorry if we have any scientists in here, like, she's really butchering these explanations. Things don't just move on their own, right? And for something to move, something has to move it. And that's a pretty big discovery. He also was able to kind of decode the mystery that is light by using prisms to refract it, to show that light is actually made up of various colors. And so he basically broke down light to help us better understand it. So all these things that were formerly basic but hugely mysterious to human beings are now having rational explanations, and it's proving to people that, yeah, we can understand, we can crack the codes all around us. It just takes the will and the open-mindedness and working together as a scientific community using scientific method to do so. So, all right. A little bit more about the Enlightenment in terms of political and philosophical theories. So Newton's discoveries he believed showed proof of God's handiwork. He didn't say, hey, look, I've disproved God by showing rational explanations for natural phenomena. He said, if anything, this shows more intelligent design on God's part, and that, you know, we were gifted with the intelligence and the rational capabilities to understand and really break down the majesty of his creation. So he was a very religious man. There is a social philosopher named Hobbes who was pretty influential. He argued that people inherently form social groups out of fear. So it's a pretty pessimistic view of humankind, that we will group up basically from a fear response. John Locke, very important philosopher of the time as well. He had a lot of really important ideas, but one of the most important was he argued that all human beings are born as what he called a tabula rasa, which basically just means a blank slate. This is really important because you think about how this really flies in the face of Puritan beliefs of predestination. The idea that like your destiny is already, your fate is already sealed and there's nothing you can do about it. You are who you are, and that is entirely through God's will, and you have basically no will. This allows for all the human will in the world, right? He's saying that, you know, it's about the context in which a person is put and placed that turns them into who they are. They're not born one way or another, which that's going to be important too when we think about concepts like the monarchy and this idea of, okay, so this guy is king because what? His dad was king? Okay, that doesn't necessarily make him a good leader. Oh, because he's ordained by God? Like, says who? I mean, in this kind of philosophy, anybody could be a king in the right circumstances. That guy just happened to be born into those right circumstances. So this is pretty huge, pretty revolutionary thinking. He had a little bit more of a positive view of people forming groups. He said that governments are formed for mutual benefit. So that actually kind of goes with what the Puritans believed, the mutual benefit of those so governed kind of thing. So, okay, there's also a bunch of philosophers in Scotland who were called the Common Sense School, and just to sum up what their ideas were in a tiny little nutshell, it basically boils down to this idea that God is reasonable and predictable, and therefore the future is rational and predictable. So this is pretty revolutionary as well. It's a much different kind of thinking than the kind of Old Testament God, where the wrath is unpredictable and could, you know, there's nothing you can do to stave it off or to understand it. This is a much more, kind of reasonable, predictable, logical way of looking at the world. So that also gives that gives a lot of I guess sort of hope for the future that wasn't there before. Like you can do things to impact your future, and so that's pretty important. Okay, empiricism. So this is the viewpoint for the time, more so. So we looked back at the Puritan viewpoint and everything being God's handiwork. So the empirical view, sort of more scientific, rational view of the world that's happening during this time, taking hold, is they're looking at they're basically saying that truth and knowledge can be found, right? That it is not a pointless pursuit. It's a noble pursuit, and truth and knowledge can be found. Right? The answers to life's questions, the codes can be cracked, right? And they can be done, it can be done through three things: through your senses, through just what's right in front of your face, what you see, what you hear, see it for yourself kind of a thing. Your direct experience as a person, and also your sense of reason, because you can't experience everything in the world, but you can take the things you already know to be true and put them together in a way that leads to logical conclusions. And they believe that from these things, human beings can unravel the mysteries of the world and the universe. It's all out there for the taking. Okay, pause there.